There is a question that critics of the Bible have been using for centuries, like a silver bullet. And it's this. Moses was born around 1393 BC. To creation, according to Noah's flood, thousands of years before. Abraham, over 400 years before. All of that happened before Moses ever set foot in this world. So the question is unavoidable. How did Moses write the book of Genesis? How could he describe the creation of the world with such precision if he wasn't there? How did he know the names of Adam and Eve, the conversations they had with God? What happened in the Garden of Eden? How did he know the details of Noah's Ark, the exact measurements, the materials, the specific instructions God gave? How could he narrate the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph with that kind of intimacy? With those private conversations? With those moments that had no witnesses? There are only three possible answers, and each one of them, when you look at it closely, completely changes the way you read the Bible. Today, we're going to go through them one by one. We're going to look at the original Hebrew texts. We're going to see what archaeology says. And by the end, you'll understand not just how Moses wrote Genesis, but why that matters for your life today. Stay with me, because what comes next is something very few people know. Before we get to the answers, I need you to understand the scale of the problem. Because if you don't understand it, you won't be able to appreciate the solution. Genesis is not a small book. It's 50 chapters, 1,533 verses. It covers a span of time that the Bible's own calculations place at several thousand years. From the creation of the universe to the death of Joseph in Egypt. And it's not just long, it's specific, detailed, specific. Genesis 6:15 gives you the exact measurements of the ark. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. Genesis 2:11 mentions the name of the Pishon River and says it wound through the whole land of Havilah, where there was gold, good gold, and where there was also bdellium and onyx. Why would a writer invent those details? What's the point of mentioning bdellium and onyx if the whole thing is fiction? Genesis 18 records a private conversation between God and Abraham about the destruction of Sodom. And yet the text captures every turn of that conversation, every nuance. Abraham bargaining and interceding for the righteous. God patiently responding to each request. Where did that come from? And there's something else that critics don't mention when they ask how Moses knew. Genesis doesn't just talk about spectacular events. It talks about emotions. It talks about Rachel being barren and how deeply that hurt her. It talks about Jacob loving Joseph more than his other sons. It talks about Joseph's brothers feeling envy and how that envy led them to sell him as a slave. It talks about Joseph weeping when he was reunited with Benjamin and having to run out of the room so no one would see him cry. Those emotional details aren't invented. They were remembered or revealed. Now let's get into the three answers. The first is the most straightforward, and it's the one that Jewish and Christian tradition has defended for more than 3,000 years. If the treaty is broken, there will be war. Are you prepared for that outcome? I am. The terms must be honored, or we face the consequences. Before you say, that's just a faith-based answer that can't be verified. Hear me out. Because there's textual evidence inside the Bible itself that explains exactly how that revelation worked. Numbers 12, verses 66 through 8. God himself speaks about Moses and says something extraordinary. He says, "When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams." With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. Face to face, clearly, not in riddles. That is a classification. The other prophets received visions, dreams, figures. Moses received direct communication. Now think about what that means for Genesis. If Moses had direct communication with God, then God could have revealed to him the events of the creation. The same way he revealed the instructions for the tabernacle. The same way he revealed the laws of Leviticus. The same way he revealed the design details of the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus 25 is a perfect example. God tells Moses, "Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." And then he gives him specific measurements, specific materials, exact proportions. Why would the creation be any different? The theologian Oswald Chambers captured this idea well in his reflections on prophecy. Revelation doesn't work like God whispering secrets. It works by giving the prophet the ability to see what has always been there. What any human eye, without that capacity, simply cannot perceive. Moses, according to the Bible, had that capacity in an exceptional way. And there's a signal in the text of Genesis itself that points toward direct revelation. It's in chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. The structure of that sentence is unusual. In classical Hebrew, when the verb precedes the subject in this kind of sentence, it communicates emphasis on the action. Not simply that God created, but that the creation itself is what defines the beginning. It's a massive theological distinction that an ordinary copyist or compiler wouldn't invent. But there are more linguistic signals in the text, pointing to a supernatural or very ancient source. In Genesis 1, the Hebrew word used for created in verse 1 is bara. And this word is fascinating. Throughout the entire Old Testament, bara is used exclusively with God as the subject. No human being ever bara something, no angel ever bara something, only God. Hebrew linguists point out that this exclusivity is not accidental. It's a deliberate semantic restriction at the audience. If the text were a late compilation from multiple sources with multiple authors, it would be virtually impossible for that semantic consistency. But if the text comes from a single source under divine inspiration, the consistency has a simple explanation. Also in Genesis 1, the phrase, "And there was evening and there was morning," repeats at the end of each day of creation. In Hebrew, Vayehi erev, Vayehi voker. This structure, evening first, then morning, seems backwards to us, but it reflects the Hebrew calendar, just as it's observed today in the Jewish Sabbath. It's a culturally specific marker that indicates the text was written within the Hebrew tradition, not adapted from another culture. But there's more, because the first answer, powerful as it is, isn't the only one. If you're getting something out of this video, hit the like button. It helps more people find this content. The second answer comes from something that seems impossible until you do the math. Oral tradition, direct transmission from eyewitnesses to their descendants, generation by generation, all the way to Moses. And when I say direct, I mean it literally. This is the piece of information that will change the way you look at the genealogies in Genesis. Adam lived 930 years. Genesis 5:5. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest-lived man in biblical history. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. And Shem, according to the biblical chronology's calculations, outlived Abraham. He could have asked him directly about the flood, about Noah, about the times before the flood. But the math gets even more impressive. A detailed analysis of the biblical genealogies shows something very few people have noticed. If we take the patriarchs' ages exactly as they appear in the text, the information could have traveled from Adam to Moses through very few direct links. According to the calculations in the biblical text, Methuselah was born while Adam was still alive. And the two coexisted for 243 years. 243 years in which Methuselah could have heard firsthand from Adam's own mouth what had happened in the Garden of Eden. The second link is Shem, Noah's son. Methuselah died the year of the flood, but Shem lived 600 years and reached the time of the patriarchs. The text's calculations show that Shem outlived Abraham by about 25 years. Think about that. Shem, who was on the ark with Noah, who heard from his father the stories of the world before the flood, lived long enough to know Abraham. Abraham knew Shem, and Abraham was the grandfather of Jacob, whose son Levi lived in Egypt. The fourth link is Kohath, son of Levi, who according to Exodus 6:16-18 was the grandfather of Moses. The fifth link is Amram, Moses' father. The man who raised the author of Genesis. 5 people. An unbroken chain of transmission from the direct eyewitness to the creation, all the way to the man who wrote it down. And I want you to stop for a moment and think about something. Today, most of us have access to our grandparents, and in many cases our great-grandparents. A grandfather born in the 1920s lived through World War II, the rise of communism, and the moon landing. If that grandfather tells you those stories in detail, you'll remember them accurately for the rest of your life, and you'll be able to pass them on. Now imagine that grandfather didn't live 100 years, but 900. That he witnessed entire centuries of human history. That he knew people who saw the beginning of everything. Oral tradition in ancient cultures wasn't the broken telephone game we imagine today. It was a highly structured system, ritually repeated, verified by the community, transmitted with deliberate precision. Cultures without writing developed extraordinary memories precisely because oral transmission was the only way to preserve what mattered. In ancient Hebrew culture, memorizing genealogies and historical accounts wasn't optional, it was central. And the patriarchs of Genesis weren't illiterate cave dwellers. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, with temples, cuneiform writing, and scribal schools. Oral tradition in that context wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated. But I want you to stop for a moment on something that often gets overlooked in this analysis. Oral tradition wasn't just telling stories. In the ancient Hebrew world, there was a practice called the zikaron, which means memorial, active remembrance. It wasn't simply recalling an event, it was reproducing it, reliving it, re-experiencing it as a community. Every time a Hebrew family told the story of Abraham, they weren't doing it like bedtime storytelling. They were doing it as an act of collective identity. These are the stories that explain who we are, where we come from, why we exist. And there's something else. The Hebrews had a figure in the community called the Zakan, the elder, whose primary role wasn't administrative, it was memorial. His responsibility was to guard and transmit the ancestors' stories with precision. It wasn't a minor role, it was one of the most respected positions in the community. When Jacob gathered his 12 sons in Genesis 49 to give them his final blessing, what he was doing was a formal act of transmission. He was handing each son the narrative of their place in God's family. That wasn't forgotten, it was repeated, it was taught to children's children. Now imagine that, during 400 years of slavery in Egypt, the Pharaoh could take away the Hebrew people's freedom. He could force them to build pyramids. He could kill their sons, but he couldn't take away their stories. The stories of Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph survived on the lips of mothers and sons in the slave camps of the Nile. They survived because those stories were the only thing they had left. And because those stories promised that it wouldn't always be like this. That is what Moses heard as a child. That is what he carried in his memory when God called him from the burning bush. But the third answer is the one that hits me hardest. And it's the one encoded in the text of Genesis itself in Hebrew, waiting for someone to notice it. There's a phrase that appears 11 times in the book of Genesis. In Hebrew, it's Eleh Toledot. In English, it's generally translated as, "These are the generations of," or "This is the book of the generations of." Genesis 2 verses 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 5 verses 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Genesis 6 verses 9. These are the generations of Noah. Genesis 10 verses 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. Genesis 11 verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. And so on throughout the book. 11 times, always structuring the book into clearly defined sections. Studying thousands of ancient cuneiform tablets, he noticed something. Those tablets always closed with a phrase at the end, not the beginning. That phrase was called a colophon, and it indicated the name of the author or owner of the document. It was the signature that certified the content. Wiseman proposed that the Toledot phrases in Genesis function exactly like those Mesopotamian colophons. If he's right, they wouldn't be introducing what comes next, but closing what came before, signing it with the name of the responsible party. When Genesis 5 verse 1 says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam," it's not saying, "Now we're going to talk about Adam." It's closing the preceding record with its signature. This document belongs to Adam's archive. And Genesis 37:2 says, "These are the generations of Jacob," closing Jacob's historical record before Joseph's story begins. Wiseman's theory doesn't have academic consensus, and there are legitimate debates about whether the Toledot function exactly like the Babylonian colophons. But what no one can deny is that the pattern exists, that it's consistent, and that it fits perfectly with the datas. If Genesis had been edited and compiled from separate sources in the 5th or 6th century BC, they don't exist. Furthermore, critics of the JEDP theory point out something the theory's originators couldn't have known. In the 20th century, archaeology began discovering texts from the ancient Near East that had exactly the characteristics, and those texts dated to the 2nd millennium BC, to Moses' time, not to later periods. What appeared to be an editorial flaw turned out to be a completely normal literary style for Moses' era. Now I want you to connect everything we've seen, because here's the full picture. I don't say that as an exaggeration, I say it as a historical assessment. Acts 7:22 says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He was educated in the court of Pharaoh. He had access to the best scribal schools of the ancient world. He knew hieroglyphic writing, probably cuneiform, and had access to Egypt's great libraries. The Egyptians were obsessive about historical records. The Hebrews who had lived in Egypt for more than 4 centuries had coexisted with that archival culture. The genealogies, the family records, the stories of the patriarchs would have been preserved with the same care the Egyptians used for their royal records. When Moses left Egypt with the people of Israel, he didn't leave only with people. He left with the collective memory of a people that had guarded its stories for generations. Direct access to God's presence in the tabernacle. I want you to stop and think about those 40 years in the desert. Because most people see them as a waiting period. Almost a punishment. Dead time in the history of Israel. It wasn't. It was the most productive writing period in ancient history. And the river stretched out before us, wider than you could ever imagine, all the way to the mountains. That's more than 180 chapters, more than 5,700 verses. Written in the desert, without libraries, without scribes at his service, without the comforts of the Pharaoh's palace where he grew up. How did he do it? Exodus 25:22 says, God would speak to Moses from above the mercy seat between the cherubim. It was the most sacred meeting place in ancient Israel. A place where God's presence dwelt in a special way. It was there that Moses received the instructions for Leviticus. It was there that he received the details of the priesthood, the laws of Deuteronomy, and very probably it was there that it wasn't revelation without history, it wasn't history without revelation, it was both together. The records written by the patriarchs, transmitted orally from generation to generation, preserved with a fidelity that is the Genesis we have. And now comes the part that matters most to me, of everything we've talked about. Why does this matter today? It's a question that affects how you read every single verse in that book. If Genesis is a late compilation of invented myths, then the creation doesn't matter, the flood doesn't matter, Abraham doesn't matter. They're nice stories, but there's nothing on which to ground your faith. But if Genesis is what the evidence suggests it is, a text that combines real historical records, the ark's measurements matter, Rachel's emotions matter, Jacob's late-night conversations matter. They aren't literary decorations. They are windows into real events. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, Every week there are videos like this one, and you won't want to miss what's coming.